Welcome out, Ian. We should have a few more people joining us, and we'll go ahead and get started in just a couple minutes. All right, welcome out, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. As always, in the GoToWebinar little interface there's a question thingy. So if you have questions or if my audio drops out or something happens, just go ahead and let me know. And you'll have access to this recording afterwards. So if you miss something or if I'm going too fast or whatever, or if you'd like a refresher, or if there's somebody on your team that wasn't able to make it or whatever, then we'll have that for you there as well. So for today, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of pick up where we left off yesterday. For those of you that were there, we're going to have like a mini refresher for just a couple minutes here and dive into some new stuff. So this is the art that we're going to be fiddling with today, and we're going to be making pretty much all of these components from scratch in the next hour, which is pretty exciting. And there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of really cool tools being used and cool features of those tools, and it's all super exciting. So I'm glad that you guys are here and excited to jump into this stuff with you. So what we're going to do is we're going to start here with this grid. It's kind of a subtle thing. If you look at the beginning of this frame here, we can see kind of the grid in the background, except it's much less intrusive than what we're seeing here. And this is actually the grid from what we were working with yesterday. And for yesterday, that matched the color scheme fine, but here it doesn't quite work. And so what I want to talk about again is how to make quick client changes using Form. And basically this is supposed to look like the terrain of the whole landscape. Like this is like the whole entire city grid that we're looking at, and these are all buildings, these little red dots or whatever, and they're all being kind of scanned. And this is actually using 4 instances of Form. So as we talked about yesterday, we could have 4 different types of Form. So the base layer here, just turn off all the visibility of these so we could just solo just the original form. So we have the master form, which is kind of like this like grid of squares, little dots there. And then we have horizontal lines, we have vertical lines, and that appears to make a grid. And then we also have the red little dots on top. And again, we want this all to instantly blend in with the background. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the designer. And you can see that we have these 4 forms here. And what I want is to, again, make this quick change. And so what I could do is go over to the color block on the master form and then get something that meshes with the current project a little bit better. That's something that's kind of like much darker there. And then what I want to do is have this be used by all of the forms. Now, Form 2 and Form 3, that's the grid, they don't have their own blocks. So they are inheriting this color from the master form. Now we just have this little Form 4 to contend with. So all I have to do here is to delete its block, and then it will also inherit the color from the master form. So when we're talking about using multiple forms, it's a great way to set your projects up like that, because then you have a lot of customization and you could make quick client changes with minimal effort, because if everybody's using the master form, then you can just make changes to the master form and it ripples down the pipeline, which is really nifty. I'm also going to, just for right now, take down the opacity of this layer on the actual whole layer itself. And we also talked about using 3D objects for form, and I'm going to cover that again very, very quickly, and also expand on what we learned yesterday. So we have form here. Just wait for that to load up. And then I'm going to go to base form, and I'm going to make an OBJ model. We're going to make the city in the background here. And I'm going to click choose OBJ. This is actually just the same city model that comes with form. So I'm just going to go ahead and click OK to apply that. And in just a moment, we will have our 3D city. I'm going to go ahead and take down the resolution of this. My computer is not doing well today for some reason. There we go. I'm going to open up OBJ settings here, and I'm going to change the particles from edges and change that to faces. And this is kind of a mess at the current moment because everything is white. So what we're going to do here is close up base form, go into particle. I'm going to change the color. Let's give it some kind of like really nasty brown color. But then the power of this is then I could go into the blend mode here, change it from normal to screen. And now these particles are going to blend with each other in a really beautiful way. And I could go back in here and fiddle with this and maybe make this darker, play with that a little bit more, get that to be in a better place. I'm not going to take the time to really perfect that, but you can see how that is potentially sexy, potentially sexy. Let's see here. So somebody's having an audio issue here. Is anybody else hearing me? Or I guess asking that question is kind of not super intelligent, because if you can't hear me, then you can't answer that question. Okay, gotcha. Okay, good. We're on track. So I have this city, which is really cool. And we talked about yesterday a little bit, this opacity over and opacity curve and using these curves. And so what I want to do is use that temporarily to work on the edges of this, because the fact that it's kind of like this square thing, I don't know, it doesn't really work for me. I want to kind of like soften those edges. So I could take opacity to over radial. And thank you, Natalie, I appreciate that. So opacity over radial, I'm gonna take the opacity curve, and I'm just gonna make this a little bit, not a little bit, make it all the way down here on the side, kind of rise in the middle, and then sink on the end here. Get that down, might have to smooth this a little bit. But essentially what we've done here is we've softened the edge. Again, I'm gonna smooth this a little bit, but we've created a softer edge radially around the city, and that kind of creates a more organic hologram type look, and it kind of recedes off naturally into the distance there, which is really cool. But what I didn't talk about yesterday is how to animate this using opacity curve offset. So if we take this down, we could actually reduce the effect of the curve. And what that's doing is it's going to kind of like eat away more at this radially. So you can see we have that. So what I did is I started down at 0 and animated this to up to 100, and then that grows out from the center. And you could see that here in the rendered final version here. Oops, zoom out a little bit. So you can see that kind of growing in from the center. It's beautiful, beautiful look. I like that. Another thing that I did that was kind of fun, I think this is kind of fun, is I wanted to kind of simulate more of like a depth of field type thing, but I didn't want to like go for a standard blur. And I was kind of inspired by the Into the Spider-Verse stuff. I had recently seen some kind of behind the scenes of how they made Into the Spider-Verse and how they didn't want to use traditional blurs to simulate depth of field. They had to do other things. They used like chromatic aberration and other like techniques like that to simulate depth of field without actually blurring anything. And so I went to disperse and twist. And of course, if we disperse this a lot, then it's just going to blow these particles to smithereens. That's not what we want. But if I take this disperse value to just a very low value like 2, it's going to disperse these particles a little bit, which kind of takes the form of them and softens them up a little bit. And so that's what I did for this final version. So you can see it's kind of like dispersed a little bit, and it's I also pushed this back in Z space a little bit and shrunk it down a little bit. But you can see how this kind of softens the edges. I don't know, it's kind of a fun trick to play with, and that's one of the cool things about these Trapcode tools and all the Red Giant tools we're going to be talking about today. They're so versatile. There's so many aspects to them. There's so many parameters and so many things that these designers of these tools thought of, that there's a lot of opportunities to use things in unconventional ways to get unconventional effects like this, and that just makes me happy. So okay, I'm going to turn off the city layer, and now I want to talk about something different. I want to talk about Trapcode Mir for a second. Excuse me. Mir, it's kind of an interesting beast, and I still feel like I'm getting acquainted with Mir, but a lot of times I'll be stuck and Mir will be the solution that bails me out. So we've talked about particular a little bit yesterday, and how particular shoots out particles, and the particles are born, they live, and then they die. And then we talked about form, how those particles just exist and create a form object. Well, Mir also creates like a form of sorts, but instead of using particles to do that, it uses a 3D mesh to do that. And so we have this kind of like mesh here by default, but it also allows us to do some really unique things as well because of that. So I'm going to solo Mir. And by the way, I'm using Mir 3. And this is important because if you go to Trapcode, the Trapcode Suite, Trapcode Suite comes with Mir, and it also comes with Mir 3. And this is an important distinction because Mir 3 is the thing that we're using. Mir 3 is just, excuse me, Mir 3 is just a really different iteration of Mir, so much so that they kept the old ones, Mir 2, and then they have Mir 3 here as well. And that's the one that we're using because it's got a lot of power to it. So the base geometry in times past has been just like this plane of mesh, and then we could add materials to it, texture it, we could repeat it. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we can do to it. We could bend it, if we want to do that. I'm gonna undo that. But in our case here, what I want to do is take the base geometry to an OBJ model. And I already have the OBJ in this scene, so I'm just going to select this from the drop down here in OBJ settings. Oops, that's the city. That's not what I wanted. I want the Mir OBJ master. There we go. And in this case, as in some cases with 3D models, when you bring them in, you want to invert the Z. And so that gives us a more accurate representation of what's going on. And this is actually like a more full 3D model. What we saw in Form with the city and the stuff we were looking at yesterday is it's kind of creates like a hologram effect because it's built out of particles. But here in Mir with this building, for example, we have an actual 3D object, and it feels more like an actual 3D object. So if I create a light, I'm just going to create like a little red light here. You can see how this works. You can see that it's responding to light. All the details of the model are responding to lights. And I could push this back in Z space and like light it from kind of a creative way. And we're seeing like those details kind of show up, which is kind of fun. So then we could use Mir to, distort this or put interesting textures on it. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we can do. So I'm gonna delete that light. And what I'm gonna do here is I'm going to close up geometry. I'm going to open up the material because I want to change the color of it. And we're going to do the same type of like brownish thing as before. Actually, before I do that, let me make this a little bit more obvious. And we're not going to be spending too much time on this, but for the shader down the shader section, we have smooth. We also have density, which is interesting and gives us a little bit more like of a solid 3D object feel. And then we also have flat, which just kind of renders things in a very flat way. And so that's what we're going to be playing with. That's harder to see when it's a darker color, but I'm going to take the color down to like a brownish thing. And then I'm done with the material section for now. Come down to the shader. And I also have a blend mode here, as we've seen in the other tools we've been playing with. I could go to the blend mode and change this to add. And so now all of these polygons are adding on top of each other. But what I really want to do here is go to the draw. I don't want to fill this. I want to use the wireframe. So as I choose wireframe, then we get this really cool look, which I love, because this is an actual 3D object. So the wireframe isn't just like an outline, it's an actual wireframe of the whole object. So it kind of gives it this, feel like we have like the structural blueprints, diagrams for this building, which is pretty cool. A couple other interesting things to know. Oh, well, let me show you this trick really quick. I forgot to show this with the morning group, so you guys are getting the privileged information. So this is actually the render of this building that I made in Cinema 4D for this project. And there's considerably more details here than in this model. For example, like there's a bunch of like, balconies on every floor, and there's a bunch of like, kind of extra lines and whatnots going on here that's not in this model. And one of the tips I've found is that if you're going to be using 3D objects in Mir, or especially Form, where you're going to be kind of creating these kind of abstractions of the 3D object, then it often doesn't make total sense to bring in all the detail. So if you look at this here, we don't have the little balconies on the sides that I have here, because there's a lot of polygons with all this stuff. And so what I will often do is create a 3D object that's a little bit more reduced, that doesn't have a lot of fine details, because Mir and Form are going to be processing those details, but we can't always see them. So it's better sometimes to create a lightweight version of that you could then use for the Trapcode stuff. And that's what I did here. Now, I like the way this looks, and this is very cool, but what I want to do is really make this pop. And the way that we're going to do that is by adding an effect called optical glow. Now, I didn't talk about this yesterday, but in all of the examples in the final versions of yesterday, optical glow was pretty much on everything. Optical glow is part of the VFX Suite, which we'll be talking about a bit more tomorrow. And it's similar to the glow in After Effects, except it's a lot better. And you will have this tool as well. And by the way, everything that we are covering today, you have already. So I'm not doing this thing where I'm like trying to tease you into like getting some new thingy that you don't have. Like by the very fact that you are here, your company has acquired all of these tools from Red Giant and you have them. So you might need to talk to your IT department and get them installed if you don't have them installed, but you own them. So just be aware of that. So you could see the difference that glow makes. I could even crank this up a little bit. So we have the amount of glow, like basically the intensity of the glow, and then we also have the size of the glow if we want to play with that. But it's a very organic glow, and the algorithm used behind the scenes is very nerdy and technical, and I don't quite understand it. But when I look at the side by sides of the optical glow in After Effects, or the regular diffuse glow in After Effects, I should say, the stylized glow versus the optical glow in the VFX suite. I mean, it's just, there's no comparison. The way that the light falls off is so much more organic and natural. And so you can pretty much apply this to like anything that we're doing today, any UI stuff, and it's just going to make it like instantly sexier. So we could come back here to Mir, and we could go to the geometry. We could adjust like rotate Y, for example. If we wanted to kind of like rotate this a little bit, you could see what that looks like. It's we have a full 3D object. It's a really cool situation we got going on here. Maybe we could make this a little bit brighter if we wanted to make some of these edges pop a little bit more. Some of them aren't quite getting in the blur threshold. We could tweak the optical glow to make those glow as well, but I'm not going to take the time to do like detailed work like that. I just want to give you a basic idea of what's going on here. One other thing, and this also is true in particular and Form as well, there's a visibility area, and you can adjust where there's clipping that occurs as far as like near the camera or far away. So if something's super far away and it's a really big model, you can kind of trim it in that way. And what I did is I used this to animate the building coming on. So I had the far cutoff point as pretty close to the camera. You can see what's happening there. As that gets closer to the camera, we're kind of like eroding away at the model. And then so what I did is I animated this value increasing over time. And so it appears to kind of like draw the building on, because we're taking that clipping plane that's kind of behind the building, so to speak, and we're extending it so that it appears to kind of like draw the building on. So what that looked like here is this. I did it pretty quick. Yeah, I don't want to take a bunch of time to draw the building on, but just be aware that that's an option as far as, you know, animating and creating objects with a lot of the Trapcode products. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to start getting into Universe. And Universe, for most customers, is kind of like this suite of products that you subscribe to. You pay like a yearly fee, I think it is. I don't know. I don't know how that works exactly, but it's a subscription product, and then they put out like new tools all the time. And when Universe first came out, the tools were a little bit more like consumer level, I should say. Like they weren't mind-blowing tools. And the thing with Universe is it installs to a bunch of different host applications. So they're not just After Effects plugins, they're for Premiere and Resolve and a bunch of other tools as well. And so, you know, a lot of the purpose of Universe, it seemed like, was to put After Effects tools into Premiere and Resolve and a bunch of the other host applications and stuff like that. And so a lot of peers that I work with were kind of like, yeah, what does Universe do for me? I don't know. And pretty much I just use Universe and Resolve, and like that's it. But Universe has grown leaps and bounds, and there are a huge host of tools that are really phenomenal in the universe. And so for the rest of the time, or for the bulk of the rest of our time, I really want to make the case that you should give Universe a look into, because there's a lot of power here of what it can do. We're just going to get our feet wet with this one called a Raygun. This is not by any stretch of the imagination like the greatest tool, but it's a cool little thing, and it's cool to be aware of, and it could save you some time. So I'm going to apply a Raygun. And again, by default, this doesn't look like anything that's going to rock anyone's world or anything, but just stay with it. What a Raygun does is it creates arrays of particles and arranges them in a grid. So there's actually three different grids here. There's a line grid, a shape grid, and a cell grid. By default, the cell grid is turned off. We can't see it, but we can see the line grid. That's the grid in the background, and the shape grid are the little squares and circles that we're seeing on top there. I don't want the line grid, so I'm going to open up the line grid and turn off draw grid. And basically what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using this to create, in the background here, you could see these, the thing that's not the grid. Basically we have like some squares moving here and some like chevrons moving, and they're kind of like moving at different rates of speed, and they're oscillating with the scale and opacity. They're going in and out of opacity, and they're scaling up and down. And so that's what we're going to make with a Raygun. Now, by default, it creates a background for some reason that I don't understand, but we're going to take down the background opacity to 0. And we have this layer solid right now, so it's just basically nothing. And so now let's work on this shape grid. And actually, before we do, I'm just going to change the grid itself. I changed the width to 4000. Now that's going to be much wider, like double the width of my current comp, which is 1920 by 1080. But then what we can do is we can go to the position value, and we can move this over time, and then we have a bunch of like room to do that because we have such a wide grid. So I'm going to take down the height to about 100. And then now we're having something that's slightly more interesting, I guess. And then we're going to increase the columns to 65. So now we have more columns of these shapes. And then also the rows, we have 8 rows smashed into this little area. Let's cut that in half to 4. Okay, so there we go. So now we have something that's slightly more interesting. Still not incredible yet. Let's go ahead and open up the shape grid and work on this. I'm going to change the colors to something that matches our project a little bit better, like a little like kind of a deeper green, and then maybe kind of like a deeper like bluish color. And that's looking pretty good. Still too vibrant for our project, but then that way you could see what's going on. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take the shape scale down a little bit. There we go. And what I want to do also, actually, I'm just going to skip ahead to shape 1 and 2. I want to change the actual shape. So I can choose one of these preset squares, you know, like pluses or, you know, common motion graphics shapes, or I can choose the sprite library or a custom layer. Actually, we're not going to use that, but that's an option to keep in mind. But when we choose sprite library, we can choose a shape button here, and then we get a lot of the shapes that we saw yesterday that ship with Trapcode products, which is pretty cool. I'm going to choose Chevron Basic, click Apply Preset. I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees, so then we have this kind of like cool chevron here. And I'm going to skip ahead to shape 2, and I'm going to do the same thing. Sprite library, choose a shape. This time I'm going to choose chevron outline to give it some variety, and we're also going to rotate this 90 degrees, which is pretty fun. And we could go ahead and bring up the opacity random on each of these so that we're not completely opaque all the way. And I also might want to reduce the size here a little bit of these. Oops, a little bit lower. Actually, you know what I'll do? It'll go up here to the master shape controls. So we have controls for each shape, but then we also have the master controls for the whole shape grid. So if I stagger this, for example, like right now they're lined up, and if I stagger this, then these rows kind of, well, they stagger, which is pretty cool. And so I might take up scale random a bit. Well, not that much, maybe like 15. There we go, a little something going on there. And I also might not want this exact grid of particles, so I can take down the shape count. And now we just have kind of like these hints of these arrows. So already we've created a series of random shapes, and they're mingled together in a random way. And we could also add 2 more shapes to this whole mess and add more complexity that way too. So this example is, again, it's not going to win any awards, but the concepts here are really potent. There's a couple other things about the shape grid that are especially cool. The effector settings. If you're familiar with Cinema 4D, one of the things that they're kind of trying to do with this effect was to make it in some ways similar to the Mograph module in Cinema 4D, kind of like a watered down, simplified 2D version of Mograph in Cinema 4D. And so we have this effector, and we're not going to use it here, but we could create like an area that when the particles pass through that area, maybe their size is affected, or their position, or their opacity is affected, or what have you. And we have control over that, which is really cool. What I want to do is I want to go into the animation settings, because the power here is that because we have the group of particles, we can tell a Raygun how to animate this, and we don't have to keyframe anything. So I can go to animation behavior and change this to oscillate. Now nothing happens because we need to enable properties to be oscillated. So I could animate size and opacity, for example. Now I'm not going to change any of these settings just so you can see what's going on here. So we are oscillating the opacity. We are also oscillating the size. Pretty cool stuff, but it's a little bit crazy. So I'm going to slow this down a lot, down from 4 to 0.7. And I'm also going to take the size amount down to like 10, so that it's just a much more subtle thing. And see, that's what I'm talking about. You know, we have these just like subtle, just kind of like undulating arrows that are kind of going back and forth there. I love that. And then as we are, you know, animating this, we could animate this again from left to right, and over time they drift, and also they change in scale and opacity, which is really cool. Now I'm going to close up shape grid. I'm going to open up cell grid, because we can do this all on the same instance of a Raygun, which is really cool. So I'm going to turn on cell grid, which creates like a fill almost. So like the line is kind of like the outline, think of it as like the stroke of the grid. shapes are kind of like these doohickeys that you could put on the grid points. And then the cell grid is like, again, like the fill of the grid. Now, what I want to do here is not match the grid size. And if we uncheck this, then this allows us to have independent squares, which is pretty cool. And I also might want to take down the cell size so that I can kind of reduce this. And this is a pretty tricky, it's a sensitive parameter. So I don't want to like do too much there. I could also adjust the offset independently, which I did. So I can move this up here. There we have our little cell grid. And I could also change the cell count. So I can drop this down a bit. I could also increase the opacity random, so there's more randomization in the opacity. And there we have a couple pretty complex patterns. Just move this down here as well. Pretty complex patterns brought to you by a Raygun. So again, a lot of flexibility there and a lot of power to play around. There's also this really weird option that I haven't really found a great use for, but it's so interesting to me that it really sticks out. But there's like a single shape. So you could have check draw a single shape and have it just draw a single shape. You could put a stroke on it. So maybe if you wanted like a big hero background thing, you can do that. I don't know what that's for, but it feels like when they put that together, there was some reason. Like there's somebody in a boardroom that was like, I got it. Let's make a single shape to this. And there's some reason for it that I haven't figured out yet that seems like it could be really cool if I was more creative. And anyways, so I'm gonna go ahead and turn off a Raygun. Let's talk about HUD components. And this is like the magic to me. Like this is like, if you're going to be creating like UI stuff and you're not using HUD components, like you're missing out. Like this is so great. Okay. And this also keeps getting better over time, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to go down here. First thing when I apply HUD components, by the way, HUD stands for heads up display. So like this plugin was designed to do the exact type of thing that we're doing right now, where we're creating UI elements. And I used this HUD components all over the place throughout this whole week of stuff. So I used it for this icon right here, this little locator thing. I'm not super happy with the way this turned out though, as far as like the colors that I used and like how I used it. So I'm not totally sold on that, but I do love the way this turned out. So I use HUD components, and this is actually what we're going to build right now, is this thing right here. So if you look the way this like animates on, there's some complexity there, some complexity to the movement and all that kind of stuff. And so we're going to create all of this right now, and we're not going to use a single keyframe. We're going to have HUD components do all the work. And we're also not going to use any presets, although you could use presets to jump around and do a bunch of cool stuff like that. But we're going to be doing all of this from scratch, which is really cool. And by the way, speaking of presets, let me just show you the presets, because when you're new to these tools, especially to the Universe ones, these presets can be a lifesaver, not just because they can be a jumping off point, but they could also be an inspiration as far as what the tools are capable of. So if I click the choose a preset button, the dashboard opens up, what's called the dashboard, the Universe dashboard. And it jumps open to the section here, and you could mouse over. These are all animated, like all throughout the dashboard. They're all like this, where you just kind of put your mouse over it, and you can kind of get a preview of what that does, and you can see what's going on here. Again, a lot of details. This is like the targeting section, and then there's stuff of like there's like a bug that's being found, and there's also like cool arcs and sciencey things. I mean, there's like your UI stuff like right there. You know, there's like all kinds of cool stuff that you can have it make for you, which is awesome. There's like progress bars, compass, clock even. I mean, there's just so much stuff that this can do. By the way, for those of you that are new to Universe and are kind of like, if I am successful today in getting you to rethink using Universe, then you might want to go here to the dashboard. I'm going to click back to Universe Effects. And then you have all this gallery in the dashboard of all these different effects you can use. So for example, like the different blurs and distortion tricks, so it's like chromatic aberration, for example, this is what that looks like. There's heat wave, which is kind of like, you know, if you're trying to create heat distortion or whatever, there's a bunch of like cool presets for a heat wave and stuff like that. Prism displacement, generators, glow, all the motion graphics tools we're gonna be looking at. Again, you just mouse over, there's a ray gun, kind of shows you what that does, that type of thing. So I'm, again, not going to use a preset. I'm just going to close this out for right now. And let's go ahead and talk about this whole thing. I'm going to take the glow intensity down to 0 because we're going to be adding, if we're going to add glow, I'm going to prefer to add that with optical glow and not here. So I'm going to go ahead and close up composite settings, and we have 4 different elements that we can add. And right now we just have the 1, and we're going to add 2 and fiddle with it. Again, this is because, especially because we turn off the glow right now, this is going to get more boring before it gets amazing, but just stay with me for just a second. So I'm going to change the element type of element 1 from measure arc to just a regular arc, which is essentially a circle. Again, it's more boring, but just stay with me. One of the things that you'll notice that's good to be aware of so you can get your bearings is that we have the same type of controls for each of these elements. And so to delineate them, to let you know exactly where you are, because there's so many parameters, like there's E1 for all the element 1 things and E2 for the element 2 things. So that way, when you're adjusting opacity, you can tell right away whether you're adjusting it for element 1 or element 2 by this suffix. Okay, so I'm going to go into arc options, and I'm going to take the segment angle to 270. I'm also going to bump up the stroke width to 8, so it's a little bit thicker. Again, this is not thrilling stuff, guys. Stay with me, almost there. So I'm going to close up arc options, and I'm going to open up clones. Now, this is where it starts getting cool. It's not going to be amazingly cool right away, but it's going to get there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the clones to 8. Okay, so now there are 8 clones of this arc on top of each other. Now, here's where it starts getting cool. We go to the clone radius offset, and I'm going to increase this to, actually, you know what, before I do that, I should do, yeah, okay, we'll do radius offset. So I'm going to do radius offset, increase this, and then as I do that, you can see that we're increasing the radius of each of the clones. So I'm going to take this actually down to 20. So now we could see all 8 of our clones. And then I can go down to clone stroke width offset. I'm going to take this to -1. So then each clone will be 1 stroke smaller, or have a smaller stroke by 1 degree than the other ones. But then the magic comes at this clone time offset. So the clone time offset, I'm just going to change this to 0.1. Oh, that didn't seem to do anything. Okay, now what I need to do though is go into randomness. So the randomness here, I go into Z rotation, and then as I increase this, what's happening is it's giving each one of these clones its own randomness. Also, and this isn't as cool, this is anticlimactic, but I could also give it its own opacity randomness as well by bumping up the random opacity. So now we have something that's pretty intricate and detailed, and we didn't have to put any effort into making it, which is awesome. But watch this, there's more. I can go into the animation area of element 1, and I could browse animations, or I could choose them from this drop-down list. But again, if you want to see a visual representation of what each one of these look like, you can click on Browse Animations, and you'll get an animated thumbnail for each. But I know I want to wiggle rotate this in 2D. So all I have to do is select that, and then look at this, play this back, and then each one of these is wiggle rotating in 2D. So I have all this complexity and detail, and it took me like no time to set it up. It's phenomenal. And watch this. If I want to animate this coming off, remember we went to our arc options and we made the segment only 270 degrees. So what I can do is I can take this down, and that's going to shrink the angle of each of these. And so I could take that down to 0. Set a keyframe, move in time, and then increase this to 270. And then what's going to happen is that all of these are going to grow on. Isn't that awesome? I love that. Also, I did say we wouldn't be setting any keyframes, and I totally lied, and I'm really sorry. I forgot that we're going to animate it coming on, and we set keyframes for that. But all the movement is keyframe free. So there's that. And so another thing that I did is I went down to element 2, and I created by default set to none. So it's just like it has the one element by default. So I'm going to add measure arc 4, And I could then go into the transforms and make this a little bit bigger. I could fill with the color and all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to do that, but I could go in here, and I didn't actually make a clone of this, but I animated the segment angle, same thing here, from like 0, and I animated that on as well in that way. Whoop, to kind of come on like that, which is really exciting. And then we could have the animation be a different way too. We could have it be a flicker or whatever, or pulse scale, or whatever we want it to do, which is pretty exciting. So that's HUD components in a nutshell. I strongly recommend giving that a chance because, again, there's a lot of opportunity to create really complex, rich pieces and not spend that much time. And realistically, I mean, when you're creating stuff like this, you know, what really sells it and makes it feel super complete is the richness of all the little details that are going on. But you really don't want to spend your time doing all of these little tiny details, like for the stuff that you can't really see in the background, that's not like the hero elements. You don't want to spend a bunch of time, like this text stuff. You don't want to spend a bunch of time, formatting these little text things that you can't even read. They're just there to be decorative. And so that's the point of these universe tools, is to, allow you to spend more time being creative and less time, with the minutia of doing the monotonous work of creating of just a bunch of details for the sake of detail. So let the software create all the details for you, and then you could just kind of like art direct those details and then focus on the creative stuff that you want to. And to that end, let's look at this text. This is actually a universe effect that I think is so brilliant, called screen text. So I'm going to turn off HUD components, turn on screen text, and I'm going to solo this. And typically, the way this works, that this is meant to be something that fills an area with text. So it's almost like set up to apply to like a solid that fills a composition, and then you could pre-comp that and then put that like in a screen or something like that somewhere. So what I did here for my work for this stuff this week is that I made solids that were smaller, and then it could fill those smaller solids. So I'm going to apply the screen text effect. And you can see it's like a little bit big for this box. But let's talk about this. Let's figure it out. I'm going to go to choose a preset. And what's really cool here is that when you're creating, again, these like little tiny details where you're, creating like a bunch of text on the side, you want it to look like it's believably text, like it's actual real text and not just like a bunch of gibberish. And so what they've done here is they've gone in and, found a bunch of, text that's code that actually is code so that it looks legitimate. So like the crypto miner hex dump, it kind of looks like a bunch of data. And then there's the FTP proxy node, and there's ones that are more kind of like repetitive, like the CryptoMiner hex dump, or like this install log, or the iPhone crash log. And there's stuff that looks like actual code, like the JavaScript or whatever. And there's some that are a little bit more graphical, like this like trident right here, which is creating shapes and stuff like that, like the ASCII stuff from previous generations or whatever. We were making objects and shapes out of these lines and stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and choose this FTP proxy node JavaScript and apply the preset. And I'm going to go ahead now and close this out. It's a little bit too big by default for what I'm looking for here. So I'm going to go into the text settings, take my font size down to like 7 or something, maybe 8 so we could see it. And then I could also adjust the scroll offset. So if I want more text here to start, I could adjust that. And I could also adjust the line shift. So I can move this down if I want to, or I could move this up or whatever. So I can just kind of like get it into place, which is really nifty. So then if I type this out, or I go and I play this back, it's going to type on automatically, which is really cool. And we're not seeing that because it's starting a little bit later, and I can go ahead and let's just start down to 0 and then move this down if we want to, so we can see the cursor, which is really cool that there is a cursor, and there's actually cursor settings if you'd like to change the look of the cursor or whatever else is going on, or turn it off or what have you. We can also change the scroll rate so we can make that faster or slower, but you can see that it's actually like typing through things or whatever, which is really cool. And so we could use the scroll rate and the scroll offset to you could animate these to get this to move as fast as we want it to create this kind of text. And that's actually the preset that I used here is the FTP proxy, blah, 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 whatever one that I just applied. Let's see that. And this is the crypto miner hex dump one down here. So it's great because this looks like two different types of data, which is exactly what I wanted, but I don't want to like search the internet for like things that look like data. I certainly don't want to type that myself and animate it coming on or whatever. So let screen text do that business for you. I love that. Okay. Kind of last, but not least, is one of the ones I use all the time for everything, and that is just an effect called line. It's just called line. And basically what it does is it creates a line. And this is surprisingly difficult to do in After Effects. I mean, it's not like difficult as in like impossible, but it does create a series of challenges. If you're going to create an arrow from like one spot to another spot, and then animate it coming on, it can present a few challenges. I mean, it's by no means impossible, but it's more steps than it should be. But with line, there's like this draw on option. So I can just kind of like start from 0 and then draw on an arrow coming on like this. Whoop. That's fantastic. And it starts from a point, kind of like this Indiana Jones, like it's starting off in like Los Angeles and going to like Sri Lanka or some place where there's artifacts. And so if I want to, I can go to the 0.1 shape and I can just turn this off, turn off that circle. So now I just have an arrow. So I do a lot of like, motion graphics, a lot of like infographics, a lot of explainer videos, and I do a lot of tutorials as well for like lynda.com, LinkedIn, and for Red Giant and stuff like that. So a lot of times I like to call stuff out. And in times past, it was just too much effort to make an arrow. It was just too much work. It wasn't worth it. But now I can adjust this however I want, which is really cool. I can go to the Bezier style. And instead of doing an auto curve, I can do like a 3-point Bezier where I have a little bit more flexibility over how this curve is shaped, which is really handy. And then as I draw it on, it follows that path really elegantly. Woo! I could also do a 4-point Bezier if I wanted to. And in this case, we're just going to do something linear. There we go. And then if I go to primary line, then we can adjust the primary shape, which is essentially the arrowhead here. And there's even like a whole area of like primary shape settings. So we could adjust like the size of the arrowhead or whatever. I could also change this to something different, like a round arrowhead, or to a locator if I wanted to make it seem like like we're going somewhere, and this is like or I want to simulate tracking markers or something like that for a tutorial or whatever. That's pretty great. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to say none. I don't want any shape here. I just want this line. And even the line style, I don't want it solid. I want it to be dashed. So I can create this dashed line, take down the line width and maybe the dash length or whatever. And I could create the dotted lines. And that's how I created these dotted lines here. Basically two instances of line, and then I animated one of the points, the start point to be here and to follow this building, and I did that for both of these or whatever. So, and that's all it is just you take draw on and you go from 0 to 100. That's really great. Oh, actually, there's one other thing that I wanted to cover, and that is stylizing footage. One of the things that Universe does really well is stylizing footage. I'm going to go ahead and apply Hollow Matrix, which is what I used here. I'm going to go ahead and, oh, I already turned off the Hollow Matrix. Okay, there we go. So Hollow Matrix was designed actually by Aaron Rabinowitz, who's now like the head of marketing at Red Giant, which is really cool. But he's also a motion graphics designer. You might have followed some of his earlier work, as he's done a lot of After Effects tutorials in the day for Creative Cow and whatnot. And he's a huge Star Wars nerd. And so he created Hollow Matrix several years ago to really accurately represent the type of holograms that you see in Star Wars A New Hope. And he's such a nerd about it. It's really adorable, and he really knows what's going on with holograms. And so he created this. And then as more movies came out and started using holograms, he started kind of like changing the tool, like what it could do. And now it's not really just for holograms. It's like really meant for making things seem like they're simulated by screens or ghosts or whatever. So if I click on choose a preset, we can kind of get a better idea of what Holomatrix is capable of. So there's the default setting, but you can see there's the franchise Awakens. So this is like kind of like what they used in Force Awakens. And then, Empire Strikes Back had their own way of doing holograms, and then Prometheus had their own way of doing things, and then there's Star Wars New Hope or whatever. And so if you want to go super nerdy, there's all these different ways of creating holograms. But if we scroll this down a little bit more here, you can see a bunch of different types of presets. So there's like different types of screens and for different styles of televisions, and there's like night vision and the predator vision, and stuff for game displays or for heads-up displays or whatever. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to choose this LCD one. I'm going to click Apply Preset, and you can see that some of them, such as the default one, colorize things, as is common for holograms, but we don't want to colorize things for this. So this LCD is not going to colorize anything. I click Apply Preset, and wait for it. Close this out, and there we go. We have this cool preset applied, which kind of creates the, you can see the pixelization, the pixelation of this as if it were a screen. And I kind of don't want that exactly. So what I could do is open up the effects to fiddle with this a little bit. Now, this seems like really crazy with all these settings, but really what this is that there is an effect. There's a lot of different effects here, and there's a check mark or checkbox to be able to turn it on and off. And then there are settings. So for example, scan lines is enabled, and then right below it are the scan line settings. So it's not as hectic as it looks. There's an option to turn a thingy on, and then there's settings for the thingy. Now I'm going to take down the line distance a little bit down to 2, and I'm also going to blur this scan line blur to 2, so it's just a little bit softer of an effect. And instead of having horizontal and vertical scan lines, I just want horizontal. I just kind of want like a subtle effect here that makes it look like this is a screen that we're seeing. And that's it. And you can see like these scan lines here, I could turn Holomatrix on and off. There's before and then after. Just kind of makes the whole thing feel more stylized, and that we're watching some presentation on some field monitor somewhere or something like that. So it kind of creates great stylization to the footage. And if we go into the effect menu and go to Universe Stylize, there are a whole host of like really, really impressive things here. For example, like the grain 16, it simulates 16 millimeter film. There's VHS, which is like one of the most commonly used universe tools, because it's so, they actually like sampled static from VHS players and whatnot. So like there's just retrograde. It's like these kind of like old school color effects and whatnot. So a lot of really great tools. Carousel the same way. A lot of really beautiful, if you're trying to make footage look like it's shot on film or from the 1940s or whatever, there's a lot of great tools for that. And one thing, I'm not going to dig into this really, but I want to show you just very quickly. There's another effect that we're not going to have time to cover, which is okay. It's not maybe the most useful, and it's also pretty self-explanatory, but there's one called Progresso that's meant, and it's another universe effect that's meant to show like progress doohickeys. So if you're kind of trying to show progress radially or like a progress bar, then Progresso is built for that to help you do that. So if I click on choose a preset, it'll open the dashboard and show you like all these different types of things that you can do with Progresso. So there's these kind of like arc things, these radial progress bars, and there's like, power up, and there's these like linear bars for progress bars, and again, like in linear sequence, and the pie charts and stuff like that. So a lot of flexibility and options with Progresso, and these are the type of things that really save you a lot of time because you can go in and just adjust the progress and then look at the numbers and all these things kind of like go along for the ride. I don't have to create expressions or make children of anything or whatever. It's just a really simple, easy, clean way to animate something increasing in progress. And you could also, connect this with expressions to actual data so that things are moving like that. And I don't know, I think it's a really cool thing to be aware of because it can bail you out. And again, we're creating a lot more detail, a lot more interest in animation with minimal effort, which is really the thing what we want to do when we're talking about building a big, fantasy UI. Okay, so that's all I have on the table here, but we have another like few minutes if there's any like questions or anything else that you want covered. We are going to be coming back tomorrow for another thing. We're going to be looking at compositing and also the VFX suite and creating some cool effects there. And so it's going to be a good time. There's also a bunch of tutorials that you can check out on the Red Giant website that are free. And also, if you or your team would like some more customized training or webinars, we'd be happy to provide that as well. So that's kind of like part of the complementary thing that ships with that your team has, part of your contract. So be aware of that. So thank you all so much for attending. We hope to see you tomorrow. And again, I'll be here for another few minutes if you have any like questions or something else that you'd like to have covered. Thanks again for joining us. My apologies for the frog in my throat for the first half of this thing. You're welcome, Natalie. Thank you. You are welcome. Thank you. All right, all. Thank you so much for joining us, and hope to see you tomorrow. Take care. Have a great day.